Okay, so welcome everyone. Today I will be focusing my talk on anger management and emotional regulation, specifically focusing on strategies for caregivers. And the goal is by the end of this talk that hopefully you'll have some practical tools to take away from some of the areas that I'm focusing on. Oops. Second, let me make up my screen too. Having a little bit of technical difficulty. Why my slides aren't changing. Oops. Okay, so the areas that I'll be talking about are looking at the emotional dysregulation that a lot of people experience following traumatic brain injury, what this looks like, and some strategies around this, what lack of insight is, specifically around someone's behavior, their mood, and sort of how they're presenting, when you're encountering lack of motivation or initiation to follow through on things, disinhibited behavior, and the importance of setting boundaries and self-management, and also looking at self-care and making sure this becomes a non-negotiable. There also is some overlap with some of these behaviors and things that I'll be covering in the presentation. So to begin with, when we're looking at emotional dysregulation, this can be a really tricky one to deal with. It often comes with extremes in behavior and mood. So people can range with high anger and aggression, which can become in the form of verbal and physical aggression. Some other people experience high levels of anxiety that can spike, that impacts their mood and sort of reactivity, high levels of irritation that can fluctuate throughout a day, low frustration and coping tolerance. And there could also be on the other end of the spectrum with dysregulation where someone is very labile, very sad or withdrawn, or even showing signs of apathy. There can be impulsivity as well within the dysregulation. And oftentimes these fluctuations that occur, whether it's frequently or periodically, at times it can be where there's apparent triggers to someone changing in their dysregulated state, or it's without warning, and it's often hard to predict that it's going to be happening. So the impact on the caregivers when you're caring for someone and supporting someone that has these dysregulated states is it can feel extremely exhausting, either during the time you're dealing with the emotional dysregulation or even anticipating it coming. It can also be very anxiety provoking when you're not really sure what to expect, whether you're going to be out in public or in the home, and these sort of outbursts and high reactivities occur. It can feel very depressing. It can impact your own mood as you're trying to support someone else and your own mood is being impacted. And it can also be very anger provoking, whether during the situation where someone is being very abrupt or heightened towards you or someone else. And it can also be anger provoking when the situation moves on and the person might have forgotten what happened, but you still have these lingering feelings. It's very worrisome to know with behavior changes, is this something that is going to stay like this, or is it going to improve in the future? And at times it can also feel very isolating, not knowing, like, are other people going through the same thing where they're caring for someone and they have to deal with all these changes and how that can feel. And when we look at behavior, specifically dysregulation, it can present very confusing, as if the person should be able to calm down and control their emotions or act more appropriately in certain situations. And so as much as we can acknowledge the brain injury, it's really, we don't see it all the time. And so it becomes really hard and confusing when we look at these behavior changes. It can feel very discouraging and disheartening. And there's also feelings of disappointment can set in when you're trying so hard to make sure that you're doing the best that you can, maybe setting up the environment to help the person not sort of get into these states that change. And if you're in, around other people or even in the community and dysregulation sets in, it can also feel very embarrassing as well. So what's really important is that when any of these feelings as a caregiver, when you experience them and they set in, is to make sure that you validate that this is how you feel, and also to know that you're not alone. And it's really, really important to try to focus on the good moments in every day, because there are always good moments, but sometimes when we have sort of situations where the behavior changes seem so predominant, it's harder for us to focus on the good moments. The one thing I'll tell you is that as a care provider, you might experience all of these things that I just listed, but I will also tell you that the person who suffered the brain injury also experiences these exact same feelings. It just might look a little bit different for them. So when we're looking at strategies, best strategies to respond to someone that's in an emotional dysregulated state is, number one, you have to really know that you are not responsible, nor are you in control of anyone else's behavior. So a lot of times people take on the responsibility when you're caring for a spouse or a child or a sibling, and you feel responsible, or that it's your obligation to try to make the situation better. But we don't have that control. The only thing you have control is over your own emotional state and your own reactivity to the situations. So when we look at your response and reactions to a negative situation that's presented, your reaction, your approach, whether you say something or don't say something, can have a positive or a negative effect on someone else, either escalating further or eventually calming back down. So oftentimes doing and saying less is better than trying to, again, react and control the situation that you just can't. That's where we consider whether in a situation that you're in, if let's say you're being ignored, or you're being yelled at, or there's commentary being displayed that's very hurtful, is whether a response is needed or if a nonverbal response would be better. It's also important to think about the words that you're using, the tone of voice, your own volume. So even if someone is yelling and they're having a louder volume, you don't need to match that in order to still communicate, or if you have to walk away, your body language is communicating that. And when we're dealing with these heightened situations, it's really, really important that you have your own calming strategies, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. So it helps you to control and reduce a tendency to react. We often react to situations that are uncomfortable, that also, present that in a way that can be intimidating or destructive. So when we look at someone else that we're caring for who's reacting very maybe heightened or disproportionate, whether it's for good reason or not, is make sure that space, when you can, is provided for yourself as well as the other person, because the most important thing in that moment is that de-escalation can happen. And if someone needs like constant care and supervision, you can't necessarily leave the room automatically, but you can make sure that you turn your attention away, or that there is no talking during a specific amount of time so that calming can actually occur. And we want to avoid giving attention to negative behaviors as not to inadvertently respond to them, because that can unfortunately escalate or perpetuate behaviors. So the timing of feedback becomes also really important. If something you're dealing with and someone is reacting in a way that's making you uncomfortable, it doesn't mean right at that specific time you're going to give feedback, because oftentimes it's not going to make a difference because it's too overwhelming to process what is being said, and your loved one isn't really going to be able to fully appreciate in that moment what is being said to them. So we're going to move on and look at lack of insight or self-awareness. And again, there's overlap with some of the things I'm discussing. So when someone has a lack of insight into their changes of mood or changes of behavior, this can be really challenging because you see it, but it doesn't mean someone else perceives what they're saying or doing in the same way. And lack of insight can really fluctuate. People can have some insight, they can have no insight, or they can have a lot of insight. And the person that suffered the injury when they have insight, it's very difficult for them too, because they are trying and they don't want to act in this way, but they don't have all the tools and the capacity to sort of control and manage their emotions and their reactions. So you'll see these reoccurring situations that become really hard to manage. So when we look at what contributes to lack of insight or self-awareness with our behavior, we factor in what someone's memory and attention is to situations, because that's really going to impact the way they look at a situation, how someone is able to recall something that occurred. And at times when attention is limited and you try to review a scenario that happened, someone might have a very distorted recall of what went down from yours. And then you have to deal with that as well, which can be really challenging. The way people perceive situations can vary. So one person can say, hey, you were really harsh and mean to me. And the person that was doing and engaging in those behaviors might not see it at all, might feel that they were very justified, or they weren't yelling, or they weren't doing anything that was contributing to a conflict. So that's where some of the rigidity in thinking happens, where again, the capacity is reduced to sort of really appreciate all the factors contributing to any given situation where there's dysregulation and changes in mood. So that rigidity in thinking can make it really hard for the person with the injury to sort of appreciate some of the other perceptions of what was going on. And there also can be, after the fact, a denial that happened. I wasn't really acting in an inappropriate way. I wasn't doing anything wrong. And the caregiver then has to sort of like deal with the fact that that's how the situation was perceived and the impact of that. We also have to consider perseveration. So people that have suffered an injury, at times there can be this need and this lack of control to sort of focus on a certain topic or a situation and repetitively go over and over it. And that can make it really hard on the caregiver, knowing like, how do I manage this situation? How do I respond or not respond to this? And aware of, the impact like of on others. So when we don't have a lot of insight or awareness of our behavior, we really don't have a full appreciation of the impact on other people, on the relationships, on the family, on friendships. So that makes it really difficult as well. So when we look at how do we manage something like this, we have to consider for your specific loved one, what is the best response? And like I said, a response doesn't necessarily have to occur within that specific moment. So it's the timing of responses are important, and not everything necessarily should be responded to. If someone has a very limited memory and it's sort of a repetitive pattern in their behavior, then they won't, nor will you, always benefit from verbally trying to address the same situation that isn't getting any better. So when someone is, displaying sort of a complete lack of awareness into their behavior, by you trying to rationalize to them in that moment why they're doing something that is impacting you negatively or someone else, those rationalizations often are not processed the way you would want them to. So that wouldn't be the right timing. And also rationalizations, we need to be careful with our sort of word choice and how much wording we're giving, because not everyone has that full capacity to appreciate what you're saying. And it's really challenging when you're confronted with, changes in behavior that are specifically towards you or other people that are around you, not to sort of react or sort of overreact, because it is uncomfortable and it is difficult to manage. But when we sort of overreact or sort of, try to control the situation that, like I said, you can't, the person that's in the dysregulated state has a higher propensity to remain in a dysregulated state or even escalate further. So that's, again, where the timing of feedback needs to be focused on as well. Determining additional supports for that person that might help with building insight. So whether that is if someone has a reduced memory capacity where the verbal responsiveness is not enough for them to really appreciate what has happened, or how to correct a situation or prevent it from being so extreme the next time. They might need certain reminders. There could be, sort of audio reminders or visual reminders or things that can help somebody if they are able to build a little bit of insight into their behavior, and especially if they want to as well. And that's where modifying your approach, and again, the wording you're using, the tone of voice, and just knowing the best time for someone to hear information, or if you're trying to build the insight, is really important. Like at the end of the day would not be a great time for most people because they're tired, they're sort of cognitively drained, emotionally drained, and that wouldn't be necessarily the best timing to have that conversation. So we also have to look at the perception on how someone sees it. And that's really a tricky one, because when someone sees a situation completely the opposite of yourself, and you're the one that's constantly providing that care and support, it makes it really hard because you can't change someone's perception. You have to work within what that perception is. And I'll address that a little bit later in some of the other slides. And this is where managing, again, the one thing that you have control over, which is yourself, is how to manage your own reactions and how to manage, what you say and what you do to sort of help continue to support the person as well as managing yourself. So the other one that we'll talk about that impacts a lot of people following brain injury is that lack of motivation or the initiation to start something or follow through with something. And before we talk more about like why that's occurring, it's really important to see what contributes to lack of motivation and initiation. So there's many variables that can impact somebody who isn't able to, let's say, follow a routine, or they say, this is my intention, and they can't kind of comply with that. And when we look at some of those factors, I've listed some examples here, which consist of, if someone's mood, their baseline mood is ultimately low, it's much harder to do things. If they have this internal feeling of discouragement, or I'm not going to do this right, or I'm going to be in too much pain, I'm not going to be able to handle this, then again, it makes it really hard to start doing something or have the motivation to do it. If there's underlying mental health conditions such as anxiety or other things like that, it makes it, again, it's another variable making it harder to kind of get through your day and set a plan and follow it. If there's chronic pain issues, chronic headaches, all of those things, pain is a very limiting factor, and you're dealing with it both psychologically and physiologically. So that can also be another kind of barrier to motivation and initiation. Low energy, someone who's very fatigued, and that's, again, these side effects that they have to deal with. Constantly feeling overwhelmed. So one thing might take a lot out of somebody, and the care provider's like, well, you did this one thing, why can't you continue on the day doing all these other things? But that one thing might have taken out a lot of energy that the person can handle. There's also confidence after suffering an injury and knowing, or whether you know or not know, that there's these limitations within some of your abilities. It really does shatter that confidence, and that impacts, again, that motivation level. The other thing is the efforts that are required to get through something or get through the entire day can also be very discouraging for somebody. And then they might decide, you know what, I'm just not going to do it. It's going to be too much for me, because again, if I factor in everything I just listed on the list in combination, it just feels at times like it's a weight on that person. And when we look at motivation specifically, we have to have a purpose for doing something. And when you have a lot of underlying factors sort of weighing you down, sometimes that purpose is harder to create or focus on. And, it does make it really difficult as the care provider trying to set everything up and help the person do everything they can. But it's the person themselves that, again, has all of these struggles that we have to just be mindful of. And the initiation piece you have on the other side is where someone actually might have the motivation and drive to do something. They know the purpose behind it, but they just can't get started. So when someone can't get started, it's looking at like what systems other than a person can help activate someone to take that first step. So not focusing on the entire day, but focusing on sort of like steps at a time within the day to make it more manageable for someone to get started. So it's basically finding a way and knowing that there is always a way. It's just a matter of being creative and looking outside of the box to know what that's going to look like. So some of the ways to help somebody, and including yourself, because we can always apply this to ourselves as well, is how to help someone with motivation is, just talking sometimes is not enough. Having visual setup. So whether that might look like, something really bold when you wake up, you see something that helps with like getting started for the day, having a mini vision board, anything like that can be visual, can be very helpful. Having a schedule, but instead of scheduling the whole day, maybe you're just focusing on the first 15 minutes of the day. Or if the last part of the day is really difficult, is having something visual set up there to help the person. Audio cues can also be very effective, whether it's through somebody's phone or tablet that is coming in. Google Homes and Alexa can also be very helpful because it can provide these prompts. So it's, again, not just you as the caregiver providing all the prompts and feeling that heavy sense of responsibility. But when we have sort of our starts for the day and breaks in the day that have these sort of boosters or motivators, it can set the tone for the day. So maybe the first part of the day or the middle part of the day wasn't great, but the day is quite long. So we want to always focus, well, the next part of the day can be a little bit better. And the person that struggles with the motivation and initiation to do things is always want to incorporate that validation in the progress that they are making, because we can lose the person that's dealing with all these things can lose sight of like, am I even making any progress? Am I moving forward? And they might focus on the limitations and what their inabilities as opposed to the abilities. And the more that we can focus on the progress, it establishes purpose. Why am I doing this? And you can always find a reason why. And if someone's struggling for that, you can obviously make some gentle suggestions on, well, how about the purpose is just for now is that your pain's going to be a little bit less if we do some stretching. Let's try that for 60 seconds and see how it goes. So it's, again, taking those small steps and building from there and having that mentality of not giving up. And you as the care provider, it takes a toll on you because you want the person that you are caring for and that you love so much to be able to follow through and sort of do these things. But you're limited because you're doing as much as you can, but you also want to be applying these things to yourself too, so that you're not sort of kind of getting lost and not becoming also the priority. When we look at behavior and the things that people have to deal with, one of the very, very common ones, and this is a big overlap with dysregulation as well, is looking at disinhibited behavior. Because again, how this appears and how it is very different. Because oftentimes people look at someone who's behaving in a way that's very off-putting or, it seems like completely out of control, is if they're intentionally doing this, or if it's, they have this way of controlling it. And disinhibited behavior does not allow a person to have that filter and that control. They don't have all of the capacity and tools to manage what they say, how they act, how they're thinking in the moment. And it can present in a very wide variety of behaviors. And I'll just go through some of them here. This is just a relatively comprehensive list where, disinhibited behavior can be verbal. So it could be like name calling, it could be lashing out and all of those things. Physical disinhibition, so touching or being too close or sort of physically reacting within their environment. Sexual disinhibition can also be a more common one that's less talked about because people are really uncomfortable with it. But again, it's something I deal with quite often in supporting people, because that's something that, you're exposed to. How do you respond to someone that's, engaging in these disinhibited behaviors, if it's directed at others or towards you? Another very common one is impulsivity, where you see such extremes, like one minute, everything seems calm and okay. The next minute it's extreme, way off on the other direction. And then it sort of derails things for a significant period of time within the day. There could be attention-seeking behaviors, sensation-seeking behaviors that a person has. Some of them present as norm violating. Some of them can result in some, criminal acts and things like that. And these disinhibited behaviors really highlight that change in the personality that you're seeing. And again, the person, unfortunately, that has these disinhibited behaviors is not able to get control out of that, because if they could, they would not be acting in that manner. So when we look at sort of reactions compared to how a person would have reacted before, the reactions seem extraordinarily disproportionate to any given situation. And then that becomes sort of like the norm that you're dealing with. So whether it's high, rage and aggressive responses to situations that seem very little, and knowing that, hey, prior to this brain injury, my loved one would never have reacted that way. The impulsivity also leads to sort of just action before there was any thought of, how is this going to impact someone else, the consequences of this behavior. If the behaviors are happening in public or around, in groups or family functions or other things like that, it presents as very inappropriately and within that social setting. And again, if you're the caregiver and you're there, you're sort of taking some of that on too, because you feel like that's also kind of reflecting a bit on you as well, even though it's not. Risk-taking behaviors can also be part of this, where again, it's the person needs sort of constant redirection or review of things or supervision, because there is risk within the behavior that can harm them. And, again, the appearance of these behaviors look oftentimes very intentional. And even though it can look that way, and at times, it can present that way, but again, it's factoring in is that area of the brain that has been injured, unfortunately, prevents the person from having those filters and from having that forethought and afterthought regarding impact on you and the consequences of their actions. So some strategies to deal with disinhibited behaviors is, again, looking at the impulsivity behind it. We can never control when something's going to happen with somebody else. Some people can be more easily triggered by others. I think appreciating what some of the triggers can be for that particular person can be helpful, but knowing that if that behavior comes out, you are only responsible for what you can do with yourself, not your control over that behavior with somebody else. And this is where the ignoring or redirecting your attention away from the behavior that can be very disturbing or very uncomfortable is crucial, because if you're not giving the attention to the behavior that you don't want to see happening, it does help to diffuse the situation, and it can help with de-escalation within that behavior context, because there's no audience for it. Although it can take some time and it varies depending on the person, knowing and setting that boundary for yourself can be really important. When there's certain situations, if you're dealing with aggression that is very severe, very destructive, if it's physical, verbal in nature, destruction of property, it is important to have some type of a safety plan on how to keep yourself safe and how to keep other members of the family safe, or other care providers that are working with this individual. And, that comes in with making sure there's some additional supports to help with making that safety plan, so that you're not putting up with certain behaviors that are really beginning to damage your own mental health and well-being because of what you're having to manage. Again, I talked before about when to provide feedback. The timing becomes really important of this. In the moment of any heightened emotion is never the time to have discussions or rationalizations. It's just really giving that space, as much for yourself as it is for the person that is in this very, very high heightened state. Boundary setting for inappropriate behaviors can happen, and I'll discuss that in a few moments, because the boundary setting is necessary as much for yourself as for the other person. Even if the person has limited memory of this, the same action that you would do would have to occur every time to make sure the boundary setting is followed through with for yourself, and not expecting the other person always to follow the boundary you're setting, as long as you're following it. Again, understanding someone's triggers can be very helpful, but I also am very aware that you can't always predict all the triggers that can happen. Sometimes someone might manage a situation beautifully, and then the next time they're in the same situation, for whatever variables have set in, they can't manage it at all. And then you have these really high behaviors that you have to deal with. So it's looking again at your reactions and how they can either sort of exacerbate behaviors or they can calm behaviors, but most importantly is looking at your own behavior too, to make sure that you don't become part of a scenario that is just making a situation even harder to manage. So when we look at boundary setting, again, the boundary setting, most importantly, really is for you and your well-being. When you're in those dual roles of, loved one and care provider, you have to be able to manage the magnitude of the changes that you've been exposed to. And in order to do that, a boundary setting, for example, might look like, when you're yelling, I'm going to allow you to continue to yell, but I'm going to be removing myself. And you don't have to verbalize that all the time. You can just simply remove yourself and make sure that you have some of those strategies, like listening to music in that moment or taking that extra long bathroom break, to really help reset and realize it's not you are not doing anything wrong in that situation. All the variables that might be contributing to the person in a dysregulated state is just having a really hard time within that moment. So a lot of times, like I said, less response is better, is one of the best approaches to use than feeling that responsibility or need to control to respond to get someone to quickly calm down and stop doing what they're doing. A lot of times it kind of will work in the opposite direction. So no response cannot fuel a behavior reaction, because behavior can influence behavior. So when we are, as ourselves, again, remove ourselves, take that step back, it can really help in a lot of situations. Sometimes people can't, again, take the space, and they need to make sure that the person is constantly watched if there's risk-taking or impulsive behaviors that might set in. But there's ways to look away and not be engaging with our eye contact with that person, or so it's not just about not saying anything, but our body also, our nonverbal body language can communicate in a way that really shows that you've disengaged from that person until they're able to settle down. And one of the hardest things that, care providers tell me is how not to take these things personally, because if different language is being used towards you, this negative commentary, or someone is completely on the opposite end and they're just not speaking to you, or they don't really want to engage with you or acknowledge or show any gratitude towards you, it's really hard not as a care provider to sort of be impacted by that. But we sort of have to then go back to the fact and remind ourselves, like, if the person, didn't suffer this injury, they wouldn't be having these struggles, and they would be more mindful to my feelings. They would be able to control more of what they don't have control over now. So we need to use strategies to make sure that you have your own mental breaks and your own ability to cope, so that it's sustainable, because behavior changes in homes and other environments, when you're dealing with them day in and day out, it's very hard on you. It's a very difficult type of responsibility. So it's important to have those breaks, and by setting those boundaries in order to be able to sustain the situations that you're dealing with. So when we look at our own self-regulation and self-management, everyone, we're all human. So not everyone is going to be like rainbows and sunshine all the time in terms of trying to control your reactions to situations as best you can. What does that look like for you? What do you need in a day to help with that? What are some of the things that are going to help with your own self-regulation? Is that going to look like making sure that you have, 5 to 10 minute breaks a handful of times a day, or having longer breaks when you can, if there's more support systems in place, so that you're able to sort of reset and disconnect from some of the magnitude of stuff you've been dealing with, so that you're always able to be the best that you can be in your role as the care provider. And that again goes down to what is in your control. And ultimately, again, it's not someone else's behavior as much as we want it to be at times. It's you are only in control of yourself, how you're going to react, how you're not going to react, and using your strategies to manage your own mood. So whether that's, exercise, making sure that you have time with people that love you, and that you have time with your friends, or you're part of a support group, or you have your own support person that helps manage and helps you sort of have that support, becomes really, really important. And as much as we want our loved ones to have these daily routines and everything that they need for their well-being, it's just as important that you set your own agenda for the day, your own routine, to make sure that whether that's taking a walk or having a coffee break or doing some meditation, some of those things help with self-regulation. So it's part of our self-care, but it also helps us improve our capacity to regulate when we're doing those things. And I think it's really important for caregivers, if this is ever applying to you, is not to blame yourself for anything. So a lot of times people will think, well, if only I didn't do this, or maybe I should have done that. But here's the thing, that might or might not have worked. And if you're constantly like worrying about, I'm at fault or I'm contributing to this person's behavior changes, then it's that kind of state of blame that really makes it really hard on you. And it's not you at all. It's just something that it's the situation that you're in. So when we set expectations, and you can set expectations for somebody that has these behavior changes 100%, but they do have to align with that person's ability. So if you're going to set an expectation for someone not to punch a hole in the wall, or someone not to respond like verbally in a way that makes you uncomfortable, sometimes those expectations, we can set them, but the person is not able within their capacity to manage that expectation. They're still going to engage in the same behaviors. And that's where your boundary setting becomes really important, where you have to say, all right, every time that particular thing happens, I'm going to be doing this for myself so that I can manage the situation better. And this helps us shift our perspective in situations. So again, we're not always like focusing on all these negative behaviors and negative moments in the day. Yes, we acknowledge they happen, but we also want to be always moving forward so that we can focus on those positive things that are happening around us, and that we create more positive things for ourselves as well, so that we have that balance. And this kind of segues into, again, that importance and having this like non-negotiable when it comes to your own self-care. It has to be a priority, because we can't provide care for someone else when we are always operating on this high level of depletion and exhaustion, which comes along with dealing with changes to someone's personality and behaviors, and also helping them cope and accept with these changes too. When the insight is there, it becomes very trying and very hard. So the self-care routines are, have to be part of day to day, not just like, I think I'm going to do this, or I'll start this tomorrow. You want to start it like today, where the routines are set, whether you write them down, you schedule them in, you have your own auditory systems and reminders coming in, because your routines, whether it's making sure you're eating properly, getting enough rest when you can, getting some fresh air, exercise, all of those things become crucial for your ability to sustain and cope with your situation. Meditation, it's not for everyone, but it can be so impactful for those that give it a try. And a lot of times people sort of have misperceptions of meditation. There's different types of meditations. There's meditations that are guided, or that are more, you're just listening to sort of, music, and you're doing breathing. But even if you were to do this for a few minutes in your own type, you can even make your own up. It just helps ground you and sort of reconnect you to yourself, so that it's important that we build our confidence and self-worth up every day as well as an individual. And some of these breathing and meditative practices in a day can be very helpful. And if someone says, well, I just don't have the time, like, try to make the time for 60 seconds and then build on that. Even if it's 60 seconds, a handful of times a day, it can be really helpful for you. Another thing that is very clinically proven to be one of the most beneficial things is incorporating daily gratitude. So starting your day, even if you're dreading what the day might look like, you've got to start your day in that mindset of, what am I grateful for? And there's always something to look at and see that you can be grateful for, whether it's about the loved one that you're caring for, or for yourself or your family, or any other scenario that you're in. The gratitude is really important, and you can't really do that enough in a day. So it doesn't have to be at the beginning or the end of the day. It can be any time that you're doing a bit of a reset break for yourself. You can focus on, okay, let me just look around for a few minutes and regroup and focus on a little bit of gratitude. And once you're in that gratitude practice, you'll notice it can really positively impact your mood as well. So when we are caring for someone, and again, they have their agendas and routines, it's just as important for you to have your own self-care routine, so that even if you only have minutes in a day that you have for yourself, is to be able to prioritize what that looks like and schedule that in, and keep yourself accountable to you to make sure that you're following that. And that's what gives you those breaks mentally and physically to reset, so that you're handling the situations that you are handling. Movement is so important. So again, whether that looks like actual exercise or stretching or walks, or just sitting outside and just just sitting in a chair and doing some movement really does help our mood, and it really helps us kind of reset mentally. So I highly recommend that is always part of someone's self-care. You can also do other things like dancing to your favorite songs, as long as there's some types of movement that is really focused on you. And the self-validation and the efforts that you're putting forth become very, very crucial, because again, we can often focus more on what didn't go right in a day or how exhausting this specific day was. But it's really important to acknowledge the efforts that you're putting in, that you continue to put in, and that, those efforts are going to allow, changes to be made, even if they're slow and they're small changes. But we always have to have the faith and belief that things are going to get better. And, when we're looking at setting and managing our own expectations, it comes with both an expectation of the loved one that you're caring for, but also of yourself. And you want to set expectations that are reasonable, and not I should be perfectly regulated and able to handle everything I'm confronted with. Again, we're all human, and it's important that what optimizes that ability to manage your expectations is incorporating the boundary setting, the daily self-care, and making sure that your perspective on a situation is really aligned with what's at the person's capacity at this given time. And as difficult as it can be for some people is making the time for yourself, and making sure that there's support that you have to find a way that you can, in fact, have some time for yourself in order to, regroup and reset. So some of the takeaways, just to recap here, again, is when we're managing very challenging and, sort of difficult behaviors, is the responsibility is taking care of yourself at the forefront as much as it is taking care of your loved one. So I talked a lot about what that was in the last couple slides, what that looks like, but it has to be a commitment to doing that, because the stronger that we feel mentally and physically, the more that we can actually tolerate and handle. Knowing that challenging and difficult behaviors is exhausting. It can absolutely break people down. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to do a presentation on this topic, is just to really highlight some of the strategies that hopefully can be effective, and to acknowledge that you're not alone in this type of situation, because the changes in behavior and personality is very, very difficult to deal with, but it's just as equally to deal with as the person that has to endure these changes to themselves and have to, compensate or operate differently in order to still have the quality of life that they're aiming for. So the process in this of learning to respond or react differently to someone's changing moods and behaviors, I always give the advice too to apply it to yourself as well. When your mood and behavior is changing, think about the responsiveness that works best for you as well. And knowing that, if you need space or you need to sort of like disengage, that we have to be able to, do that for somebody else to make it beneficial for them. And not being afraid to ask for additional help. There's support systems obviously available, and making sure that you are well connected so that you have people that can relate and that are here to support you becomes really important and part of that self-care routine. And that's where setting the healthy boundaries for yourself and the expectations for yourself and your loved one can become more manageable. And you can see, I think, more differences as well. So, when we look at all of these things that someone as a care provider has to manage, it's really like, instead of looking at the big picture, is focusing on just taking one step at a time. So whatever goals you have set, and you don't want to like set the standard too low, is just work on taking that one step. And if that one step didn't work out, like, try not to be discouraged. You take another step. And that's how we keep moving in the upward direction, is not giving up and making sure that we're just doing what we can manage, push ourselves a little bit more, focusing on that gratitude to kind of give us that extra boost. And that helps us to keep going. And, importantly is when there's situations that are very, very disturbing or very uncomfortable to deal with, is know that the moments of dysregulation or disinhibited behaviors that you're seeing, they do pass. They don't last for, a 24-hour cycle. It can go in cycles, but know that this is not like a permanent situation. It's going to pass. You want to move on from difficult moments so that you are looking ahead and you are looking at the potential and the positives that can be in front of you, because that mentality is very crucial when you're trying to move forward and make the best of a situation that you're in. And focusing on, again, what is in your control, and not focusing and trying to manage things that aren't within your control, because that becomes a really downward spiral. So, one step at a time, and really trying to incorporate some of these strategies to make your own personalized situation more manageable, and to provide you with that feeling and sense of empowerment. So that summarizes my talk for now, and I wanted to leave a little bit of time if anyone has any additional strategies they need or scenarios they want to share where they would like some supports that I can provide right now. I'm going to open the floor to please feel free to ask me any questions.